you want to think things are going to happen, you have to believe in miracles. Because Israel is no doubt that Israel, excuse me, still survives is a miracle. Now, just a little bit about the history, which we know about him before. He was born in Plonsk. He was David Gurion. He was one of 11 children. His father was a Zionist, right? So he was already involved in this kind of environment. And I'm going through the history of who he was very quickly because we've done it before, and hopefully people know this, this kind of history, right? He writes in his stuff that he just felt directionless. So he moved to Warsaw. Warsaw at the time had a very big Jewish community and, Yiddish and all this kind of thing. But he arrived in Palestine in 1906. Now, Palestine at the time was being run, or was part of the Ottoman Empire, right, before the First World War. Okay? So he learned Turkish. Now, there's a great description that he writes of when he arrived off the boat in Yaffle. I'm not going to go into it. But the most important impression that was made on him was the fact that the Arabs controlled Yaffle. They brought him off the ship in a rowing boat. All the work that was being done on every level was being done by Arabs. So that already planted not in the back of his mind, the front of his mind, where his priority was going to be. And we're going to see in a minute. But after World War I, he was exiled. He went to America. He married Paula. He came to Palestine, and he became the undisputed leader of the Yishuv. That's Ben Gurion standing on one leg kind of thing, right? But that's him, the man, the history of the man. But in order to understand Ben Gurion and the history and the new history, you have to understand two things. One is you have to understand the visionary, or to get to grips with what the visionary was all about. Now, he was a young idealist from a very early age. His grandfather taught him Hebrew, and Hebrew for him became the medium, the road, the only way that you were going to get to having a state was through language and through Hebrew. Not only that, but he studied Torah from an early age. He knew the Tanakh backwards, upside down, as if he had been to a yeshiva. And that's a very, very important part that people like me tend to disregard unjustifiably and wrongly. And you'll see why that's changing. At the same time, and that's where this quote comes in order to be a realist, you have to believe in miracles, was this balancing of what I call the idealism that he had with the realism that he had to face with what he saw. Okay, so this is where this fits in. I'm one point behind my what you call it. But for him, the Tanakh, the Bible, is the story of the Jewish people. It's the history of the Jewish people. It's what makes the Jewish people tick and what keeps the Jewish people as a people and a nation, and we're going to need a state. He loved the prophets. He loved the Bible. And as a young teenager, as a young idealist, he formed what was called the Ezra group. We taught Hebrew like Habonim of its day, or Bnei Akiva of its day. But he taught Hebrew to the young people around him. And I said, 1906 he arrived, but soon after he arrived, he got malaria. And he went to Jerusalem, where the most important thing was he changed his name. And he then demanded that anybody and everybody who was going to be involved in leadership within the Yishuv had to have a Hebrew name. And Hebrew names became absolutely critical to him. Now, to understand the ideology, you need to understand a few things about Israel itself. You know, Israel hasn't got a written constitution, unlike the states. We can't say, Article 2 allows me to have a gun and kill everyone. Israel hasn't got a written constitution, but it's got articles when laws become part of the constitution. Now, this was the first sort of basic article, and I've underlined the clash here between the idealism and the realism. And you're going to see what I've done in the next slide. But here, what have you got? It's Jewish immigration, not immigration for everybody. So Chok HaShvut, the law of return, is discriminatory from its fundamental inception. Why? Because it's about the ingathering of the exiles. Kibbutz Galuyot. But all of its inhabitants will have freedom and justice and peace like the prophets saw. That's all well and good, the two sitting together, as long as what? The Jews are in the majority. It will guarantee, now you go and you can see it, I'm going to read it because it's absolutely critical. This. All inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex, it will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. And furthermore, it will safeguard the holy places of all religions and faithful to the principles of the United Nations. Now, within that statement itself, you can see the problem. And here's the problem, according to Ian Lucas, stealing from all other kinds of places. And this is what the new historians and people like me are having to come to grips with. The ideology is all well and good, but there are three things involved here. Being Jewish, having the whole of Yehuda v'Shomron, the whole of Judah and Samaria, the whole of the Promised Land, and the third thing is democracy. The three don't go together. Because if you have Jews and Yehuda v'Shomron, you annex it, within a few years, you will have an Arab majority, or close to it, or 50-50. And then what? Are you going to have a Bantustan South Africa solution? So Jewish and Greater Israel means democracy goes out the window. If you want democracy and Greater Israel, which means annexing the West Bank and having the Palestinians in one state solution, which is that what talks about, it won't be Jewish. Or you want to have Jewish and democracy, then you can't have your annexation of Yehuda v'Shomron. Now, Ben Gurion understood this way back, that in all intents and purposes, what I'd read beforehand was a two-state solution. And he knew that. But he didn't want a two-state solution because he was a great lover of the Palestinians. He wasn't. But Ben Gurion, in his legacy, never wrote things down. And in all the documentation that's come out, they can't find stuff written by Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion used to talk, and you'll see why in a minute. So that's the ideology sitting with the history and the realism, the idealist and the realist. But now what are the new historians coming out with? And this is based on a whole lot of them. But the guy that I focused on a lot more than others was a guy by the name of Tom Segev. And if you're interested in the history, read Tom Segev, because Tom Segev wrote the biography of Ben Gurion, and he was a Ben Gurion acolyte like me. He's written about 6 books about Ben Gurion. The latest book's called A State at Any Cost. And that's, by the way, where this new coalition grabbed the slogan from, right? So the book that Segev wrote is called A State at Any Cost. For people who are interested, they go read it. It's really interesting read. But Ben Gurion was a very divisive leader, and that we know from the early days, the days of the Irgun and the Altalena. He believed that he was always right. He detested Menachem Begin unbelievably. He believed that Menachem Begin was a greater threat to Israel than the Palestinians or anybody else because of the divisiveness. But he himself was very divisive. He was also very callous in the sense of he wasn't empathetic or sympathetic to the survivors of the Holocaust, for example, people coming off the ships. He demanded that the youngsters or young people, anyone who could carry on, get sent to the front when the War of Independence was on. He, more than anybody else, demanded, almost became cannon fodder or something. That's really the unacceptable terminology, but it was almost like that. But he was what I call a pragmatist playing a double game. This realism with idealism, right? He would trade off one against the other, particularly when it came to the Arab problem. Now, when it came to the Arab question, the Arab problem, the Palestinian issue, Zionism always got preference over peace. That's a hell of a statement there. In other words, if I've got a choice between not being democratic or not being whiter than white, or not being the most moral army in the world, which is bullshit, by the way, and we're going to come to that next week and the week after, because the issues that came out of it and all this documentation, including Ben Gurion. So he, in 1948, was instrumental in ensuring that the message of helping, in inverted commas, Arabs fleeing their villages, he understood that if he wrote that down anywhere or sent a memorandum saying these villages have got to be Arab-fried or Juden-fried, you can imagine what would happen. But the spirit of what he used to say and do was picked up very, 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 very quickly and very easily, right? Difficult to find proof of that, but the documentation coming out of the meetings of the cabinet in 48, when other ministers have documented what they said and what they brought to cabinet meetings, is sufficient to see the impact, there's another word for that, and the influence and the power, and how convincing Ben Gurion could be in making sure that as many Palestinians fled their villages as was possible, did so. Now, we can debate whether that's morally justified or not at another time. That's not the issue. The issue here is Ben Gurion, his leadership, and what's coming out of the new history. They're also trying to, and this is what really rankles me, trying to judge by today's standards the behavior of 73 years ago. Now, Ben Gurion was into all kinds of things like Buddhism and Hinduism. He used to stand on his head on the beach often. There's a famous picture of him standing on his head. So these new historians, some of them, not all of them, not Tom Seger, but some of the younger ones, saying, well, we feel that he probably had mental health issues. Which is, you know what? I'm not even going to go down that road because it's irrelevant. It's got nothing to do with history. It's got nothing to do with the impact on what he had. But what does Tom Segev describe him as? A Zionist Lenin, a non-communist Zionist Bolshevik. That's a hell of a statement. Anybody who knows anything about Russian history will know what that means. Now, there is no doubt in my mind that the impact on Israeli society. Okay, so we've looked, let me go back there 1 second. That's what the new historians are coming out with the stuff that they're looking at. In, broken it down, I'm oversimplified it, obviously, right? Because in an hour, I can't do what 73 years of history are doing. In half an hour, never mind an hour. But what we can look at is the impact that he's had on Israeli society and on Israel generally. The first thing is, there's no doubt in my mind, without Ben Gurion, I'm not sure a state would have come about when it did. And I say when it did advisedly, right? I'm not going to say without him it wouldn't have happened. That would be nonsense. But when it did, I'm not sure that there were any other leaders around it, including Menachem Begin, by the way, who would have believed in their own strength and the messianic. I call it messianic. He believed that Israel would survive, where a lot of other people didn't in 48. Remember, you had 7 Arab armies. We discussed, and if you want to see the videos, in the video other project that I'm doing, there's a video on the 48 war and whether Israel was going to survive or not. But more than anybody else, Ben Gurion was absolutely convinced that Israel would survive. And without him, at that time, I'm not sure the state would have been created. Now, land empty of Arabs is also a myth, by the way, that a lot of right-wing hawks like to throw around and say the land was empty of Arabs. We didn't throw the Arabs out. It's nonsense. And it's time that people started realizing that's nonsense and living up to the fact that this is what happens in war and all kinds. It doesn't matter, right? The policy of land empty of Arabs was not about ethnic cleansing. It wasn't. And when people like the BDS movement accuse Israel of ethnic cleansing, that's where people like me, who are fairly dovish and believe in my Zionism, go berserk. Because that then turns me off any discussion with anybody about what Zionism is and what Israel is. Israel did not ethnically clean Palestine. Israel did some really bad things in order things that would happen, but to say that Israel had a policy of ethnically cleansing Palestine of Arabs is not acceptable. And I will debate that with anyone anywhere. But he did what he did. The biggest impact in my estimation, it's not too harsh, after the creation of the state, the impact on Israeli society was turning the desert green. Now, people need to understand that in 1948, Israel was more or less a desert by and large. Most of the country was the Negev. There was nothing there other than desert. You go there today, and you'll go to places like Sde Boker, the kibbutz, or Beersheba, and you'll see what technology did to turning the desert green. And it's not by chance that Israel's the trailblazer of finding clean water all over the world. I remember the drip feeding, everyone remember the drip feeding thing that used to happen in all the orchards way back, right? And a lot of us picked bloody oranges and God alone knows what, then I've killed ourselves. But what was turning Israel green was this drip feeding mechanism. We had pipes that had holes in them and just drip fed water into the trees in the 1950s. So the impact, and this is Ben Gurion, by the way, turning the desert green is part of his messianic belief. And he went and he lived out his last years on Sde Boker, and people will know that. People might have visited there. If ever you go to Israel, by the way, and you get a chance to go south, you should. It's unbelievable. And if you haven't been there for 10 years, you won't recognize any of it. And you go to Sde Boker and you'll see the museum and the stuff that he's got there. So for Ben Gurion, the slogan, the state at any cost, is what drove him, what drove his beliefs in what it should look like right up until after the 6-Day War. Ben Gurion, after the 6-Day War, when he was already down the road on dementia, he really was, but he wasn't quite there yet. I remember when he came to South Africa, which must have been 1969 or 1970. And he'd lost the plot by then, right? But for people like me to shake his hand kind of thing, like shaking God's hand. After the 6-Day War, he went to the Knesset. He made a speech in the Knesset about how Israel had to ensure that it didn't hold on to the occupied territories. 1967. Nobody listened. And this is where we are. So the impact on Israeli society, the state at any cost, and getting that triangle to somehow work. And if you remember it, I'm just going to actually want to go back there a minute, because the triangle there, this is what his messianicism and his vision and his belief was about. And I really believe it. We call it the two-state solution now. He called it something. I didn't call it anything. Okay, so